Hi, everybody. My name's Kimberly Maize, and I am a trauma resolution expert. I am the creator of the Trauma Response Syndrome model and a previous clinical social worker turned trauma revolutionary. I am proud to introduce my daughter and co host, Savannah Woodard.
Thanks, Mom. I'm Savannah, a second generation trauma specialist, a trauma informed coach, and care advocate, and together we are a new generation.
We are a mother daughter powerhouse duo determined to decrease the stigma of trauma and bring focus to healing transgenerational trauma through open conversations.
Please listen as we share our story on how we healed transgenerational trauma through radical self awareness and responsibility.
Because remember, when families heal,
Society heals.
thank you.
Thank you. Hi, and welcome back to a New Generation podcast.
Hi, everybody.
Today, we will be starting a 4-part series on boundaries. Today's episode 1, we will be talking all about boundaries in daily life. We will also be talking about ambivalent attachment issues, which is a core concept from the trauma response syndrome model, which is the model that my mother created and the model that we work from in pretty much everything that we do. Ambivalent attachment issues are results of inconsistency in childhood and a lack of secure attachment. A major component of ambivalent attachment issues is that we often abandon ourselves in order to avoid abandonment and in order to prove our worth.
Yes.
Today, we will be talking about 4 major components of daily life. We'll be talking about boundaries within our relationships with our children, relationships with romantic partners, as well as social groups and work life.
Yes.
And so the first question that I would like to ask you today is, how do you feel like this affects relationships?
Sure. So, to go back to ambivalent attachment issues a little bit, that's the core of trauma motivated behaviors. So when we're thinking about what motivates us to do what we do, when trauma motivates our behaviors, we need to think about what needs that we're trying to get met with what we do. And so I also want to say that ambivalent attachment issues is different than ambivalent attachment style. It's based on a concept by Dr. Colin Ross called ambivalent attachment to perpetrator, which is another aspect of the trauma response syndrome model. But I noticed through my own self discovery and my own recovery, and from working with hundreds and hundreds of people, that ambivalence goes far beyond just being ambivalent towards the people that hurt us. We can be ambivalent towards everything in life, ourselves, our children, our work, because it becomes a foundation of how we relate to the world. Ambivalence basically means feeling the opposite emotion at the same time. I love and I hate at the same time, or the whole continuum of those experiences in emotion and feeling. So when we think about when trauma motivates behaviors, what we're trying to do is avoid abandonment, prove our worth, get connection, and maintain trauma bonds. Those are some strong motivations for behaviors. Those are the needs that we're trying to get met. And through ambivalent attachment, so for instance, the ambivalence is created when a caregiver can meet our needs occasionally. And so the child is trying to get their needs met all the time and believe that through their behaviors, somehow that can change the way that their caregiver relates to them. But in fact, it's the caregiver's responsibility to attach to the child securely, and they're often too traumatized and not securely attached themselves, and so they're not able to consistently meet the needs of their children. I would like to remind people that children need good enough parents. They don't need perfect parents, but we're talking about parents whose trauma motivates their parenting, and it comes out in how they relate to their children through ambivalence. Savannah will be talking about ambivalence with children later on. But as far as ambivalent attachment issues in relationships, what we often see and experience is what a lot of people talk about, where we're trying to get our needs met from someone who is basically not capable. We're trying to, a strong motivation for behavior is to resolve early life trauma through recreation through another person. We're also doing everything that we can to avoid being abandoned. So that's the need that we're trying to get met. So the trauma motivation of behavior is maintaining our trauma bonds or maintaining our family systems, because we're trying to avoid abandonment, and we're also trying to prove our worth. So that's a very strong motivation for behavior. So if we're looking at when trauma is motivating our behaviors and we're just acting to get those needs met, there's no boundaries anywhere. It's because we're not thinking about ourselves or the other person necessarily. We're just trying to get our needs met. So if we're trying to avoid abandonment, we're going to do whatever we can to avoid abandonment. What I'm talking about with ambivalent attachment issues and another trauma response syndrome model concept, which is internalized blame of self, but that's for another time in future episodes. I do want to say that those two concepts together are the foundation of what's called borderline personality disorder. We don't need to look at that label. We can literally look at how is trauma motivating this person to do what they're doing. So if the need they're getting met is to avoid abandonment, that means they're going to do anything that they can, which means attention seeking behaviors, which of course we're have attention seeking behaviors. What else would we be doing? Every trauma response is normalized in the trauma response syndrome model. Manipulation, lying, all of it is a normal trauma responses, considering the needs that people are trying to get met. And so if our needs are motivating our behaviors, then there's no boundaries that we're setting. Because our rational mind might be saying, I want to leave this scenario, which would be a boundary, but the drive to avoid abandonment and maintain this trauma bond trumps that. There's no rational mind when trauma motivates behaviors. And so we act from that place to try to get our needs met, abandon ourselves, and have no boundaries.
Yeah. So, with all of that being said, do you feel like you have specific examples of the way people may abandon themselves in order to prove their worth?
Yes, absolutely. If we look at the core of many trauma, let's see, I differentiate between a trauma bond and a trauma-based relationship, because in a trauma-based relationship, two people might connect over the fact that they have trauma. But if both of those people are working on their trauma and trying to resolve their trauma motivated behaviors and their attachment issues, then those relationships have potential of working out, where a trauma bond doesn't. A trauma bond is that people are solely trying to get needs met from people who aren't capable, and we try to do that over and over again. And so I would say specifically one of the strongest trauma motivated behaviors is trying to prove our worth. And when we look at how people are behaving and what they're doing, because that's what we do, is we focus on how trauma motivates behaviors to try to get needs met. And then we learn how to get those needs met in more life-serving ways. That's how we can resolve and heal our trauma. And so if you look at, okay, what have I done in a relationship to try to prove my worth? Well, it's the dynamic of, this person is hurting me, then I'm going to internalize that and do things to try to get the dynamic to change. And so that may be, paying someone's bills. That may be justifying abuse. That is always internalizing blame, and do things that are above and beyond what the relationship dynamic calls for. Because this is a trauma bond. Why am I continually trying to, buy this person things, cook this person food, do all of these things to try to get that person to see us specifically? And again, when we're doing those things, there's no boundaries anywhere, because trauma is such a strong drive when it's motivating behaviors. And so, that is one thing I think when we're talking about boundary setting, is that people who have complex trauma, who have trauma such as us, we're not taught boundaries, we're not shown boundaries, or I wasn't. I wouldn't say that you really were in any circumstance much either.
Until I was older.
Yeah, until you were
about
older.
13 or 14, which we've talked about in other episodes,
Yeah.
how those boundaries really impacted me because I hadn't had them before.
Right. Yeah. So, when those young emotional states are trying to get needs met, that's the only drive there is. There isn't like, oh, should I set a boundary? Or it's one of the strongest motivations for behaviors is proving worth. And we're trying to get our unmet needs met from childhood in our current life.
Well, and I think it's really important here to just maybe talk a little bit about how oftentimes people feel as though their own behavior can change an outcome of somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And they feel like if they can prove their worth and do certain things, they're going to get a specific outcome. And that's how people continually try to get their own needs met, is they believe that they're able to do something that they're really not able to, which feeds this cycle
Mm-hmm.
of not being good enough. And I'm going to keep proving my worth, and it never is successful. So I continually feel more worse and more worse about myself.
Yes. And it's not successful because the person that we're trying to get our needs from aren't capable.
Right.
They're not capable. And sometimes we're putting needs on those people that don't belong to them.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, I think that it's really important that we say a lot of times our rational mind is thinking one thing. And because these needs that are unmet are from childhood, we're often trying to get our needs met from a childlike perspective.
Yeah.
And so our adult self is saying and thinking and doing one thing, and then often our behavior will be doing something that doesn't match because it's coming from, an unresolved place, but also often a childlike place.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really important that we do our work so that we can, be able to age successfully and try to get those needs met in more life-serving ways.
Yeah, integrate.
Yeah.
Integrate. And so, when we have certain experiences happen to us when we're young, trigger warning here. I'm going to talk about child sexual abuse for a second. When you have, I'll take my circumstance, my example, for instance. When you have the severity of child sexual abuse and you're shown and taught that your only worth is sex, that becomes such a strong motivation for behaviors that it drives us to do things that completely re-traumatize us as adults, which is something to think about. Is our adult trauma responses re-traumatize us. It's not only people outside of us, experiences outside of us, those kinds of things. We re-traumatize ourselves with our trauma motivated behaviors from the moment we are consciously aware of what we're doing. Usually around puberty is when developmentally our perspective changes. And so when there was nothing else in my awareness other than sexual interactions with people, because I did not believe, no matter what I had going for me, which was a lot, I always was sexually motivated, because that was all the only way I knew how to prove my worth. And so instead of using my rational mind and boundaries and making decisions with who I'm having sex with, I just was motivated to have sex, because that would then prove my worth and somehow ease my suffering.
Yeah, that's really interesting to reflect back on as an adult, being your child and hearing this. I mean, I've heard this before, but, it just sinks in more and more every time to really think about, what was going on in my childhood, the people that were coming into my life as a child and her partners. And just, it's really apparent now that that's what was going on, that
Yeah.
you weren't consciously and rationally picking a partner that would better serve your family or your child.
Never.
It was only to prove your worth to someone who was incapable of seeing
Mm-hmm.
it. And that's kind of healing for me to hear you say that, because it's like, oh, wait, it wasn't necessarily that I didn't matter. It's just that you were trying to get your needs met.
Right. Always.
And it's just really interesting as an
Mm-hmm.
adult child to reflect on that with my parent. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a big part of why we do this, because we want you all to see that we can have these difficult conversations. Our point of view can change over time through reflection, and through this, it's just really cool to, just to be able to grow with you.
Yeah, you too. And there are sometimes parents who are capable of resolving their own trauma and shame around that trauma in order to repair. And we've talked a lot about that, and what we're doing, and what we assist people in doing with family systems, because that's, when families heal, society heals.
Mm-hmm.
But the point being is that when trauma motivates behaviors, there are no boundaries, because there's no rational thinking going on. That's the one thing that I really, really noticed over the decades of doing this is, especially with myself and witnessing other people, is like when the behaviors and the thoughts, it's like I can intellectually and rationally understand that this situation is abusive. I need to leave this situation. It's not serving me. And then I leave, and then this person would text or something, and there's no rational thought. It's just, how can I prove to this person that I am worth something for them to continue to engage with me, no matter how bad they treated me? It's like, well, as long as they're engaging with me, that means somehow I have worth and I can resolve my early trauma, because it's all about early trauma. No matter what we're doing in our adult lives, it's always about avoiding or trying to resolve or heal or recreate or something our original pain.
Well, and I would definitely say that perspective is what is the missing link in a lot of treatment for trauma. And the people that come to our office, I feel as though that is what they say. Understanding how trauma motivates behavior, how your childhood trauma motivates your behavior as an adult, is the game changer. Based off of what we're saying right now, all of these things of like, if we were more aware of how our childhood trauma affect our behavior as an adult, I feel like people would be able to heal so much quicker, because they have such a radical sense of self-awareness that a lot of us haven't had up until this point.
Well, and the key is realizing, what needs am I getting met by doing this?
Right.
And the needs aren't obvious. And people who securely attached have different needs than people who didn't. So we can't go into this thinking, oh, all people's needs are to get community or to get this, and because those are securely attached needs.
Right.
That doesn't mean we don't need them. a matter of fact, one of a motivation for behaviors is community. But how we get there is trauma motivated.
Right.
And so it doesn't make sense to people. It's like, what are you doing? Well, look at it from a trauma perspective. I'm trying to get, that's another thing about when how child sexual abuse can motivate people who are trying to get their connection needs met or their attachment needs met, and they don't know how to in any other way except sex, which was definitely me. I was not interested in the sex. I was interested in the false sense of connection that I got when I was with somebody, but it was so re-traumatizing. So I wasn't actually getting my needs met, but that's what was motivating me to keep doing it, partly. So I need to learn how to get that connection need met in a more life-serving way.
Yeah, and I know that this is kind of a complex perspective that we're talking about here, and this is a fairly new perspective to a lot of people, which is why we've decided that we're going to do an 8-part series in this podcast to talk about all the 8 specific, the 8 main motivators, the trauma motivated behaviors, and we're going to do an episode on each one of those to really be able to in detail explain what we're talking about, because I feel, and I know you feel, obviously you're the creator, but this is so crucial for treating our own trauma and also for those who assist in recovery to understand the people that are coming into their office to really understand this. So we're going to break that down very soon. So
future episodes.
Yeah, future episodes.
So let's move on a little bit and talk about how boundaries impact parenting. So Savannah, you're currently raising 2 young boys. How do you think that boundaries impact your parenting? And do you feel like your enmeshment with me affects the way that you parent? Your past enmeshment with me?
Yes, past. Key. So I feel like when I first became a parent, I knew nothing about boundaries. This was before we had really worked on our work. We had done a little bit together, but I was definitely fully enmeshed with you when I had first become a parent.
Oh, sure.
And so I feel like my life or my relationship with my kids has drastically changed since we lost their father in 2019. I feel like before that, my primary role was caretaker in a big way. I was a caretaker for him. I was a caretaker for kids. And because I had so much going on, it wasn't really an option for me to have boundaries. So when they were really young, I would say that we were enmeshed. A lot of what we did was from me trying to prove my worth and try to get my own needs met and fulfill my own caretaker role. And I didn't realize that was happening until after Curtis had passed away. So in the beginning, I feel like I didn't really ever take time for myself. It was really hard for me to, take self-care. I had to be in control at all times. And so I was always hyper-focused on being the one that was in charge. There was really a lack of boundaries during that time. And then once my husband passed away, and I've talked quite a bit about my relationship with Curtis and enmeshment and how I really had to abandon myself to maintain that relationship. So if you don't really know too much about that, before you listen to this episode, maybe go back to the other episodes and really dive in to what is building up to this answer, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So with all that being said, after Curtis passed away, I really became aware of the lack of space that was in my life for me. Whether that had to do with you and our enmeshment, whether that had to do with Curtis and our enmeshment, or whether that had to do with my sons and our enmeshment. And the last couple of years have really been me trying to develop a healthier relationship with my kids and with myself in turn, right? Oops, got my microphone here. And so, this applies to both my kids, but I'm going to talk about my younger son at first. I feel as though Veda, his personality is very much a people person. He's very much an extrovert. He's very dependent on other people. He's very high energy. He always wants to be doing something, which is great. He's has a lot of love for life, which is phenomenal. But when a parent is experiencing that on the day-to-day and doesn't know how to set boundaries, it's going to build some sort of ambivalent attachment issues.
Mm-hmm.
In order for me to not feel ambivalent to him, I have to be able to set boundaries within myself.
Right. Yeah.
I have to be able to say, and I've posted this all over the internet on TikTok and everything, all different places where I have had to tell my son many times in the last couple of years, I love you and how inquisitive you are, and I'm questioned out.
Mm-hmm.
Or I need just 10 minutes alone. I know you struggle being alone, and mommy has to have some alone time. And I feel like those boundaries are crucial in order to be a good parent, or at least a good enough parent, right? We need to be able to have time to settle our nervous system, to have alone time, to have autonomy, to really know what we think and believe, to process these very grown-up things. I feel like that was a big issue that I had when it comes to having a lack of boundaries with my kids, was that I had a lot going on in my life. And a lot of trauma that was going on with my life, especially with their dad and his chronic illness. And because I never set any boundaries with anybody, I never had time to process what was going on. And I think that's one of the reasons why Curtis's death was so tragic, because not only did I process the grief of him dying and being chronically ill, but all of the trauma that I had suppressed over the decades of my life. And I do now, looking back, if I would have set stronger boundaries, this is a hour for me once a week to think about my childhood trauma. This is another hour once a week for me to go to therapy. And this is another hour for me to work out or whatever. I would have had so much more space to be a better person, you know?
That dynamic with him didn't allow that.
The dynamic with him did not allow that. And it's really easy for me to now see how I'm recreating, or how I was recreating, that relationship with Veda. Because it's easy for him to want to enmesh, and it's actually harder for me to set boundaries with him. It's more natural and easier for me to just completely abandon myself and just barrel through and pretend like nothing's happening. That's what my norm is from my childhood, to just abandon myself and be a caretaker.
Right.
So that would kind of be easier in a way, just because it wouldn't be challenging. It wouldn't be, there wouldn't be the pushback that I experienced from him. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've seen over time, is because Veda and I were enmeshed. I started setting boundaries. He's not used to that. And so now he's pushing boundaries even more. And I could very easily just fall apart and abandon myself and let him just run the show. But that doesn't make for a very well-adjusted adult. I mean, I'm sure we all know the adults out there that just are entitled and arrogant and do whatever they want. And they don't consider the people around them. And that's not the kind of kid that I want to raise into an adult. And so those boundaries are really critical, even though it's hard and it's challenging for him and me. It's really critical for him to become a well-adjusted adult. My other son, Ezra, is a totally different kid. He's very independent. He does his own thing. He was a different age when my husband passed away, so that enmeshment isn't really there. But boundaries with him, I have to be a lot more methodical with the way that I parent him, and be more mindful of alone time and being around other kids. So it's just interesting that they both need different boundaries.
Yeah, they're like polar opposite children.
Polar opposite. And they're only 14 months apart, which I think was another reason why I had such a hard time setting boundaries, because they both needed different boundaries all the time to get the same outcome. And I just wasn't well adjusted enough to be able to do that. Now we're very structured. We're very organized. There's non-negotiables, and they mostly get the independence that they want. And the reason why they can be that independent 90% of the time is because the non-negotiables that are there the other 10% of the time.
Yeah. And I think that, they did have very tragic trauma very early, and many different kinds. And it was, their trauma responses definitely come out in their behaviors, and that would be challenging for many parents if they didn't understand how trauma affects behaviors. I think that especially Veda would be parented very differently than he is, because people wouldn't understand his behaviors and would just think that he was acting out or doing something wrong. And that's not how we see anybody's behaviors, really.
Absolutely. And I feel like it's taken me some time through healthy boundaries to be able to let him be himself, because he is very, well, both of them, both my kids are very high energy. I was just talking to the girl, I was getting my hair cut yesterday, and I was just reflecting because I was finally away from them. In summer as parents, we're constantly around them, and I was away from them. And we were just talking about how high energy and how much we let them be free thinkers and we let them be independent, such an amazing thing. But you don't really realize then they're free thinking all over the house.
Yeah.
They're trying to make their own decisions and they're trying to insert their opinion. And a lot of parents would be overwhelmed by that. And they would say, you shut up and do what you're supposed to do and be quiet. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of talking things through and applying healthy boundaries to really let them be free and also understand the boundaries in life, because there's boundaries everywhere we go.
Yes.
But to go back a little bit on what you were saying, and kind of the theme of this here is ambivalent attachment issues. And I've talked a lot about, I feel like my son and our dynamic, and now I want to talk a little bit about me more and my dynamic of that. For so many years, I was really trying to prove my worth through my children. And I was abandoning myself, right, in order to avoid abandonment from my kids and my husband, my family system at the time, and also to prove my worth. I felt like that if I didn't abandon myself, I wouldn't be this quote unquote good mom. And I feel like I robbed myself quite a bit of their childhood in a few ways around this, and that I didn't really just allow myself to be the parent that I'm naturally good at. Now I feel like I'm the parent that I'm actually supposed to be. And I'm strong and I'm confident and I'm a really good parent. And that's because I realized that for so many years, I felt like I wasn't a good parent because I was trying to get my needs met through my children rather than just parenting them.
Which was our issue.
Right. And that's what a lot of this podcast has been teaching me so much of, like, I'm really starting to see how our dynamic could easily be passed on to my kids, and all of the steps, mostly boundaries, that I'm taking to keep that from happening, and that you're taking, and that my husband's taking, and all of those things. But it's
interesting, though, when I think about it, because I didn't consciously feel any ambivalence towards you when you were a kid. I didn't consciously feel that towards you. I never felt like I didn't want you. I mean, I was 17 when I found out I was pregnant. There was never any question at all that I wouldn't have you at all. It was always that never did I feel like I shouldn't have you or didn't want you, but because of the severity of my trauma causing me to be inconsistent, you became very ambivalent towards me. And because I was trying to get my needs met through you, there was no real parenting dynamic.
Well, and I've thought about this a little bit since, because, we talk about this before we record, and I've thought about this a little bit since we were talking last. And I feel like that's true for both of us, that neither one of us are really all that ambivalent towards our children. What we more do is that we internalize their behavior and become ambivalent to ourselves. And I feel like that's been true for both of us, is that I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I've never once, and no shame if you have, I'm just saying from my experience,
not at all.
I've never really felt ambivalent to my kids. I always knew I wanted to be a mom. I knew I wanted to be a mom from a young age. I had a moment of overwhelm when I found out I was pregnant, but generally I just have always been really family oriented in that way, and I wanted to be a mom. And I think because that's my predisposition, and I tend to be really hard on myself and internalize things, I always was ambivalent to myself. Am I a good enough mom? Am I worthy of being a mom? Am I cut out to be a mom? And I would then have ambivalence that way. And I feel like they have felt that.
Yeah.
They can tell when I'm doubting myself, or I'm shut down or upset for whatever reason. So it impacts them, but I don't think it's direct ambivalence. And I would say that's true for you. Would you say that's true for you as well?
Yeah, for sure. But I would like to reiterate that it's very, very common to be ambivalent towards children, to not want your children sometimes, to wish you would have never had them, to fantasize about having another life, all of those things. That's completely normal. Remember, kids don't need perfect parents. But it's the direct inability to connect, which affects the children. And there's no, it's never too late to repair that. Trauma makes us do and feel many complex ways, especially towards our children. And it's never too late to repair.
Okay, so Mom, I feel like we've talked a lot about relationships and family systems. Let's talk a little bit outside of that scope. Do you want to share a little bit about boundaries within the workplace?
Sure. And this is why I think talking about this is really important, is because work environments are very similar to family systems and often with the same traumas. And so, what's really difficult is when people in positions of power are have trauma motivated behaviors and are trying to get their own unmet needs met to the detriment of the people that they work with.
Right.
In addition, I've worked in many clinical settings where people in position of helping others are also trying to get unmet needs met through the people they work with to the detriment of their clients. I think that's one of the most difficult things, is that people bring their trauma anywhere they go. And I experience a great deal of pushback in the agencies that I worked with because I was talking about complex trauma related issues and trauma motivated behaviors long before it was socially acceptable. And people were threatened by the perspective I had and didn't feel comfortable with the things I was saying because I was challenging the diagnostic perspective that was foundation to even places later on when I went to work for agencies who were said they were trauma informed, really, really weren't. And the things I said was challenging. There were many instances where supervisors that I had would cross my boundaries because they were needing to maintain their position and feelings of power, which their trauma motivated behaviors would trump anything else, which is the whole point with this perspective, is that when trauma motivates behaviors, that's basically all that matters. There's no rational thinking. And so even when I would challenge somebody with what their decisions are, it didn't matter because of the way that they had to see themselves in the workplace. And like I said before, there were so many instances where I saw my coworkers and other therapists and clinicians um, lacking boundaries with their clients, and essentially re-traumatizing them because they were trying to get their rescuer need met. I'm going to rescue these people to prove my worth, to prove what a good therapist I was. And they were, instead of realizing what people really need is to not be rescued and to have really strong boundaries. I mean, our role as people who assist in recovery is to model what securely attached, regulated people look like and feel like. And part of that is setting boundaries. And it is completely understandable and acceptable that the people that we work with are going to challenge and test our boundaries. That's a part of working with people impacted by trauma. They're going to do all kinds of things to test whether you're going to abandon them, whether you're going to judge them. That's a big one. You're going to shame them, judge them, abandon them, and they'll test that. And they'll test that all the time. And our role is to model what kind of reaction they would get if it was from a securely attached, grounded, well-adjusted person.
Well, and I do want to say that almost every person I've ever worked with in direct care is coming to my office to try to repair what she's describing in a dynamic.
Yes, absolutely.
And that they often say that a big part of how my role is different is that I assert boundaries, where in the past one of those other people would have enmeshed or rescued or whatever that may be. So it's very prevalent, even if it doesn't seem like it would be. It's very prevalent that people feel traumatized by someone asserting their power when it's not appropriate.
Yes. Well, and I this is why I think what we're doing is so important, is because my goal is to help people understand, as many people as we can understand, how to work with us. How to work with us, meaning people who have histories of very complex trauma, is that you need to see the world from the way we see it to be able to meet the needs. And I think even the most well-intended people who assist in recovery don't really understand a lot of the time what their role is or how to appropriately and in a life-serving way assert boundaries and show people a different way of showing up in the world, because we don't know how. We weren't taught. I everything that I know I learned through modeling, from watching other people, because I was basically raised by wolves. So that's a very important role of helping professionals, people who assist in recovery. Another thing is that when we're working in agencies where the power dynamics are so skewed because the people in power are unresolved and traumatized and want to be the ones making all the decisions, it can put people in danger, essentially. I worked at a community mental health center in downtown Tucson, Arizona, and I was a lead trauma therapist, and we worked with a lot of veterans because, as we may have talked about here, or actually we were talking about on our Instagram lives, which are on Mondays. We worked with a lot of veterans because a lot of veterans told us they didn't feel like they could safely share their experiences because of the mentality of the military of just kind of soldier up and deal with it, even if they were in a treatment center for post-traumatic stress. So they showed up outside of the military system often. And I was working with a Marine, and he was a career military. He had, military, he was on full disability from military trauma. And, he was severely traumatized by his childhood and being in the military, which is one of the things that, again, we talk about a lot, is that a lot of people join the military to escape traumatic childhoods, which means they essentially go into the military already traumatized. And that was definitely the case with this man. He had a wife and 4 children, but he, over the course of us seeing each other as a therapist and a client, he felt like he had fallen in love with me. We talked endlessly about transference and what it really means, and unconditional caring, and all those the things that I provided him, because I will work with somebody who feels that way when they will talk to me about understanding that it's not really about me. Even if they feel that way, it's not.
What needs are they getting met?
Unless, some helping, some people who assist in recovery do that with their clients. I mean, they do have inappropriate relationships, but let's just assume that there's a lot of people who aren't.
Yeah.
Let's assume that. And to talk with them about, this isn't really about me. You're not in love with me. You think you are, and it feels that way, but this is why. But no matter how much we talked about it continued to progress, and he started being more and more forward. And then he bought me pretty expensive jewelry for Christmas, and that was, that was really crossing a line, and I was starting to kind of feel unsafe. And I took it to my supervisor, and she said I needed to continue seeing him. And there's nowhere anywhere where that would be okay.
Mm-mm.
And but she wanted to be the one making the decision, because she was the position of power, and she wanted to make that decision herself, because she was the supervisor, and I was the one who said I'm not going to see him anymore. And she said, well, yes, you are. And that was when I knew the people running this show are too traumatized to be able to be in positions of power. That's one of the reasons I left that mental health system agency, swearing I would never talk about trauma again. I was so traumatized by that experience that I was like, done. I'm like, I will never do that again. Well,
Here we are.
That's what happens when you try to, stray from your life's work, but it never works. But that's how traumatic. And it was because of the organization, not because of the people that I work with. And that was 1000% a lack of boundaries in all areas of that organization, which is dangerous for the clinicians and dangerous for the clients.
Yeah, and I feel like I've experienced that in the workplace quite a bit, not necessarily in that same dynamic, but whether that was when I was in college and serving, or working
Oh,
for a
yeah.
small business owner,
Oh, yeah.
or even in, trying to work in agencies today, or trying to work in my own small business, or whatever that may be. Anywhere that I've really had to interact with people, I've had some sort of power differentiation where there was a misuse of power and people didn't really understand what was going on. So there was a lack of boundaries. And I feel like that's pretty common, especially, at work, where we spend a lot of our time, a majority of our time, people really try to assert their power.
Right. And like I said before, any organization or business or anything like that is very similar to a family system. And the people coming in all have their own trauma. And I think that's really critical to remember, that our trauma responses are not only triggered by relationships that are friends, family, or romantic. They are also triggered in response to bosses and organizational dynamics. It's very, very common. And because we have no power, when we think, if our jobs, our well-being is in the hands of somebody who's has no boundaries and is traumatized, we don't have a lot of options but to internalize blame, which
Right.
is why it's so important to realize, wait, my trauma responses are being triggered. Why in this organization? And how does that, you know, how do I have to abandon myself to maintain this job? And is it worth it? I don't think so.
It may be for a short amount of time to try to find a plan B.
Absolutely. And that's
Yeah.
the other thing is that many of our trauma motivated behaviors, like one of the strongest motivations is to maintain a family system. And that's because we don't have any other choice. It's like we can't tell people, like, how I was raised and how what was going on when I was trying to be a single mom. Is like, I didn't have an option but to have a babysitter who was my family of origin. And that is rampantly prevalent And so there's very lots of complex reasons why people continue to have trauma motivated behaviors.
Mhm.
So we've been talking a lot about boundaries in other areas, our relationship, work, with parenting. Our final subject is on social settings. You and I have talked a lot about how you have had a lot of struggle socially and what have you had to do to conform. Would you like to talk a little more about that?
Mhm. I think this is a pretty layered question for me. But I think the first thing to be said is I have known for a really long time that I was different. That I was different, the way that I relate to people, my sense of loyalty, my sense of integrity. I feel like I've always had really high expectations in that regard, even from a young age, even to the point of my own detriment. Um, I feel like I first really started realizing how different I was, maybe third, fourth, fifth grade. There was a specific group of kids that I was hanging out with in my elementary school that were considered to be popular, and I was having kind of a hard time with them. I feel like when I first started elementary school, I was definitely different, doing my own thing, kind of in my own world. And then around that age, something inside of me changed. I realized that either I was very different and had to conform, or I was very different and would always be an outcast. And I was hyper aware of that. And there was a specific instance in fifth grade that I remember where I think that I switched. And um, my teacher in fifth grade was very heavy. I'm not going to say his name. He's passed now, but still, it's just so he was really heavy, and his wife had passed away that week at school, and he had missed a week of school, and he came back and let all the kids know, "I'm sorry that I left unexpectedly, but my wife died unexpectedly." And I could feel how vulnerable he was. And I don't know if the other kids could, if they didn't care, if they didn't feel it, but I was so empathetic that his wife had died that I felt sad. I remember feeling sad for him and going through the class that day, just being really aware of him and what he had been through.
Hmm.
And then our first recess that day, so it was like an hour or two after we had just heard that, one of the girls, the most popular girl at the school at the time, was out there making fun of him and saying that because he was so fat, he had rolled on his wife and she had suffocated in the night. And I remember thinking at the time, how old are you in fifth grade? I was what,
Hmm.
like 12, 11 or 12, something around there.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking at the time just how absolutely horrible that was. And I couldn't even be in the presence of it. It affected me. I could feel it so deeply, like not just what she was saying that was mean, but how much it would have impacted him.
Hmm.
And so I don't remember if I went to him or if I went to the principal or who, but I went and told on them. And I said, "This is so mean. She's out there. I don't think she should be saying it." And she got in trouble. And after she had done her detention or whatever, the next day we had all come back to school and everyone had turned on me. They
Mm.
didn't turn on her, who was being an obvious bully. I had completely thought, wow, she's gonna suffer consequences from this. I feel like I did such a good thing. So to go to school
Yeah.
and be considered like, a narc and this just awful person that I could be, they were just like pushing me away, and I couldn't handle it. I was so sensitive.
Hmm.
I'm still like that. I'm still pretty sensitive. I literally couldn't handle it, and I knew at that time, either you bully or you become the bully. Or no, you're bullied or you become the bully.
Hmm.
And it was so clear to me on how to mask. If I just act like her, then they're going to like me. And that's what I did. I slowly started becoming more like them. I started making fun of that teacher with them. I started making fun of the other kids. There was one other girl in particular that I can think of. Now we're friends and, distant friends on Facebook. We're grown and have moved across the country. But I remember, her being kind of a focal point of the bullying and bullying her. And I talked to her about it later that I was sorry that we went through that. We've made up, but it was just this whole thing. And I feel like that's the first time that I really was like, okay, you can either be yourself and be eaten alive
Mm.
or conform to those around you. And I feel like I could do it on my own just by pretending for a couple years. But then once I got to middle school, there was a lot going on. I was removed from the home. I was sent away. I came back and I just couldn't mask on my own anymore. I just couldn't do it. And I don't totally know why. Something happened inside of me where I just couldn't pretend anymore. And that's when I started using substances. And I
Mm-hmm.
was, 13. I started drinking. I started using pretty hard drugs for my age, snorting my friend's Ritalin and really using substances, getting psychedelics from my friend whose brother was in high school. And it happened really quickly. And like at the time, I didn't totally know what was going on. But now I recognize how much I was abandoning myself and not setting boundaries in order to not be abandoned or become vulnerable by them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's either eat or be eaten, that
Mm-hmm.
whole thing. And it was just so apparent. And I continued to abandon myself over and over again. I started drinking more, I started using drugs. And I do remember very faint moments in high school where I was like, this is not the person that I want to be. And I know this is not the person that I want to be. Yet I kept doing it because I didn't want to be bullied. And there
Mm-hmm.
were a few times throughout high school in this friend group where I did try to stand up to the popular kids that I was hanging out with. And I got so made fun of that they didn't hang out with me for a week.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that, where it was so cutthroat. I don't know if all high schools are like that, but it was so cutthroat that I could not have any boundaries at all.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my really good friends now, my best friend to this day, Indigo, we weren't friends throughout high school. And I asked her, why weren't we friends?
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't really put two and two together. And she said, because you were a bully.
Oh, wow.
You were mean to me. And there were two instances where I should have set boundaries with them to protect Indigo, and I didn't. And I abandoned myself instead.
Yeah.
So I feel like this has been a very common theme throughout my life where
Mhm.
I recognize you can either set boundaries and be an outcast, or you can
Yes.
abandon yourself entirely and fit in. And I feel like I did that until just a few years ago. And after Curtis passed away, I couldn't mask anymore.
Mhm.
I just couldn't do it. It was something inside of me where I was just like, life is too short. I can't pretend anymore.
Mhm.
And it really made me think of all the times I have really abandoned myself to fit into a
Mhm.
social setting. And I've lost a lot of like friends over the last 5 years that I now
Mhm.
realize weren't really my friends unless
No.
I abandoned myself and had
Right.
no boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I think that that's applicable to most dynamics, is especially families too. It's like if it's like those of us who who begin trauma work and start doing our trauma work are most often the scapegoats, and we're most often the ones that are seen as the problem. And unless we abandon ourselves to maintain the family system, then we will be abandoned. And that's the same kind of dynamic that goes on to the playground.
well, and that's really what happened to me my senior year of high school. I had a complete mental breakdown and started using really heavy drugs because I started setting boundaries within my friend group, and I lost all of them. I
Mm-hmm.
lost my best friends. I lost my partner at the time. I regained Indigo after that, so it was a blessing in disguise. But there were just certain things that were being said about one person, and I just couldn't handle it. It was just too much for me, and I lost every single one of my friends. And I was
Mm-hmm.
one of the most popular kids,
Mm-hmm.
and I lost everything. It was devastating. You remember?
Who?
I don't really want to say, but
Oh, yeah.
it was a whole
Yeah.
thing. It was really
Mm-hmm.
awful.
Yeah, I
So
remember.
yeah. So I feel like we've covered quite a bit today. We've talked a little bit about boundaries within our romantic relationships, relationships with our children, as well as the workplace and social settings.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the final question I have for you is, do you have any actionable steps for individuals who have a hard time setting boundaries?
Yes. I think the most important thing to understand is the reason why people have such a hard time setting boundaries are multi-layered and complex. People are still trying to get their needs met, and trauma is motivating their behaviors. And I think that we're always going to go back to self-reflection, because we look at how trauma motivates behaviors. And so if we are looking at ourselves and considering, you know, am I is there trauma motivating my behavior? What is it that I'm doing right now? Am I abandoning myself to avoid being abandoned or to prove our worth? How can I get that need met in a more life-serving way, which of course would allow me to then set boundaries. If I realize, I'm trying to avoid being abandoned, then we do our abandonment work with a trauma specialist, is what I would say. But, that's where the work is. And instead of looking at, the relationship, looking at how am I trying to avoid abandonment in this scenario? And also thinking about, like, what's my action right now? Why am I doing it? What's motivating me? What relationships am I in my life, which include romantic, friends, family, work, the coffee shop owner, whatever, is triggering my internalized blame of self, or is triggering me to abandon myself? And are there ways that I can set boundaries in those relationships? Because of course, the trigger is going to give you an idea that there's something not rational going on, because that's why we internalize blame, is in response to irrational behaviors. And it's all about understanding how we are trying to get unmet needs met through people who aren't capable, and therefore trauma's the sole motivator for what we're doing, and there are no boundaries there. And so there's many complex layers to healing from trauma, but when you understand it from this perspective, it's just a matter of, okay, this is the need I'm trying to get met with this behavior. And does this need belong to this person? Are they capable of meeting that need? Of course, this is a very simplistic way of explaining a very long process sometimes, but learning to set boundaries is much deeper than is often talked about. Like, we don't need to just learn how. We need to learn why we don't.
Change our beliefs.
Yes, and change our trauma responses and how we're responding to our environment. And then we can recognize, okay, I don't need to get my needs met in these self-detrimental ways. I can learn how to get my needs met in more life-serving ways. And that's our whole goal.
That's great advice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, like we said, today was the start of a 4-part series. We talked all about boundaries in daily life, these 4 different topics that we brought up today. Next week, we will be talking about, it'll be our second part of a 4-part series on boundaries. We're going to be introducing radical boundaries and our perspective on radical boundaries and how they affect our life, both positively and negatively. So we hope to see you all, or we appreciate you all listening in and watching on YouTube here, and we hope to see you every Wednesday. And thank you so much. Thanks for this conversation, Mom.
Sure. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.